Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, also known as Napoleon I, was a French military leader. An emperor who conquered much of Europe in the early 19th century. Born on the island of Corsica, Napoleon rapidly rose through the ranks of the military during the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. After seizing political power in France in a 1799 coup d'état, he crowned himself emperor in 1804. Shrewd, ambitious and a skilled military strategist, Napoleon successfully waged war against various coalitions of European nations and expanded his empire. However, after a disastrous French invasion of Russia in 1812, Napoleon abdicated the throne 2 years later and was exiled to the island of Elba. In 1815, he briefly returned to power in his 100 Days campaign. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, he abdicated once again and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died at 51. Accusations of foul play have swirled around Napoleon Bonaparte's death for nearly 200 years. Despite the original autopsy findings, which said the French emperor had succumbed to stomach cancer, now a comprehensive medical study says evidence for the original diagnosis, and not poisoning, is overwhelming. "I think that is accurate," said Owen Connolly, author of several books on Napoleon and history professor at the University of South Carolina. "The same thing killed his father and one of his sisters, Pauline," added Connolly, who was not involved in the study. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte has long been a point of contention. Some say he was killed by a stomach ulcer and others say it was murder. But a new discovery points to the fact that the real culprit may have been a particular shade of green. This green, called Scheele's green, was the invention of a Swedish chemist, and was used in the wallpaper that covered many rooms of Napoleon's exile home. Unfortunately, when the dye gets damp, it also gets moldy and releases arsenic into the air. After being handed his final defeat by the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to exile on the tiny, South Atlantic island of St. Helena. When he died, the cause wasn't certain. There were a number of people on the island with him who had reason to want him dead. Not least of all the head of his household, whose wife reportedly became Napoleon's mistress and bore his child. Murder seemed likely, but so did the chronic illness that he had long complained of. The first examination of his body found a cancerous stomach ulcer that was reported to be the reason for his death. That reason stood comfortably until the 1960s, when advances in toxicology allowed some of Napoleon's hair to be tested. High amounts of arsenic were found, along with a book that had been on the island that detailed how to poison someone. But a closer examination of Napoleon's surroundings has singled out an unlikely culprit for administering the arsenic: the color green. More specifically, a type of green pigment called Scheele's green. Invented by a Swedish chemist named Scheele, the coloring was cheap and easy to process, making it a popular pigment to use in a wide variety of household items starting in the 1770s. It wasn't until more than 100 years later that an Italian chemist took a closer look at the pigment. When items containing the pigment got damp and were allowed to mold, a reaction began that produced copper arsenic. The presence of the copper arsenic then started another reaction in which the arsenic was vaporized and released into the air. Wallpaper samples taken from the house at the time Napoleon lived there still exist, and are stamped with floral patterns in Scheele green. Finding the deadly pigment in the wallpaper suddenly made a lot more of the circumstances surrounding Napoleon's last day make much more sense. Napoleon wasn't the only one suffering from the symptoms of poisoning. Those who lived with him recorded their rather considerable physical distress, from stomach pains to swelling in their extremities. Several people, including a child and Napoleon's personal butler, also died. One of the places that the offending wallpaper was found was in Napoleon's bathroom, where he also had a large copper bathtub which he would spend hours in. And even today, the Longwood house needs to be re-wallpapered every few years, because of the humidity on the island, making it, and the bathroom, a perfect place for the chemical reaction that would release arsenic into the air. While the existence of his stomach ulcer is undeniable, it's highly possible that the presence of arsenic helped speed up his death as well as impacted the health of those around him. The head of his household complained of symptoms similar to those of arsenic poisoning. including 5 long weeks of extreme pain leading up to the death of Napoleon. Napoleon's body was originally interred on the island, only later moved back to France to be buried. When he was moved, it was found that there was little to no decomposition, even after the 19 years he had been entombed. Arsenic could be partially reprehensible for aiding in the preservation process. Similar to mummification, preservative chemicals work best when applied to both the inside and outside of the body, suggesting that the arsenic hadn't been entirely consumed, as was a trend at the time, but also present in the air as well. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. He was the second of 8 surviving children born to Carlo Bonaparte, 1746 to 1785, a lawyer, and Letizia Romolino Bonaparte, 1750 to 1836. Although his parents were members of the minor Corsican nobility, the family was not wealthy. The year before Napoleon's birth, France acquired Corsica from the city-state of Genoa, Italy. Napoleon later adopted a French spelling of his last name. As a boy, Napoleon attended school in mainland France, where he learned the French language, and went on to graduate from a French military academy in 1785. He then became a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment of the French army. The French Revolution began in 1789, and within 3 years revolutionaries had overthrown the monarchy and proclaimed a French republic. During the early years of the revolution, Napoleon was largely on leave from the military and home in Corsica, where he became affiliated with the Jacobins, a pro-democracy political group. In 1793, following a clash with the nationalist Corsican governor, Pasquale Paoli, 1725 to 1807, the Bonaparte family fled their native island for mainland France, where Napoleon returned to military duty. In France, Napoleon became associated with Augustin Robespierre, 1763 to 1794. The brother of revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758 to 1794. A Jacobin who was a key force behind the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 1794, a period of violence against enemies of the revolution. During this time, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of brigadier general in the army. However, after Robespierre fell from power and was guillotined, along with Augustin, in July 1794, Napoleon was briefly put under house arrest for his ties to the brothers. In 1795, Napoleon helped suppress a royalist insurrection against the revolutionary government in Paris, and was promoted to major general. In 1796, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais, 1763 to 1814, a stylish widow 6 years his senior who had 2 teenage children. More than a decade later, in 1809, after Napoleon had no offspring of his own with Empress Josephine, he had their marriage annulled so he could find a new wife and produce an heir. In 1810, he wed Marie-Louise, 1791 to 1847, the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. The following year, she gave birth to their son, Napoleon François Joseph Charles Bonaparte, 1811 to 1832, who became known as Napoleon II, and was given the title King of Rome. In addition to his son with Marie-Louise, Napoleon had several illegitimate children. In October 1815, Napoleon was exiled to the remote, British-held island of St. Helena, in the South Atlantic Ocean. He died there on May 5, 1821, at age 51, most likely from stomach cancer. During his time in power, Napoleon often posed for paintings with his hand in his vest, leading to some speculation after his death that he had been plagued by stomach pain for years. Napoleon was buried on the island despite his request to be laid to rest on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I have loved so much. In 1840, his remains were returned to France and entombed in a crypt at Les Invalides in Paris, where other French military leaders are interred. What do experts say about Napoleon's dead? During his reign of more than a decade, Napoleon at times controlled most of Europe, was defeated and exiled, escaped, reclaimed his title, met his final military defeat at Waterloo, and was exiled again to the Atlantic Ocean island of St. Helena. He died there 6 years later in 1821. Ever since, the circumstances of his death have inspired spirited debate. Some experts argue that powerful men French, English, Or maybe a combination feared the ex-emperor might escape exile again and retake France. Some of these conspiracy proponents suggest that Napoleon was slowly poisoned with arsenic, perhaps in his wine or food. Studies of Napoleon's hair have revealed high levels of arsenic. But critics say medicines, and even hair tonic of the era sometimes contained the toxic element. To attempt to solve the puzzle, the international team behind the new study used current medical techniques to analyze the writings of Napoleon's doctors, his family's medical records, and eyewitness reports, some of which have only recently come to light. The researchers found nothing to indicate arsenic poisoning, such as hemorrhaging inside the heart, in the historical data. What they did find was strong evidence of gastric cancer, rapid weight loss, a stomach filled with a grainy substance indicative of gastrointestinal bleeding, and something of a smoking gun. The 19th century doctors had detailed a large lesion on the exile's stomach. After cross-referencing the old descriptions with modern pictures of 50 harmless ulcers and 50 gastric cancers, the researchers reached their conclusion. It was a huge mass from the entrance of his stomach to the exit, said Robert Genta, a pathology and internal medicine professor at the University of Texas, in a statement. It was at least 10 centimeters, 4 inches, long. Size alone suggests the lesion was cancer, said Genta, senior author of the new study, which appears in this month's issue of the journal Nature Clinical Practice Gastroenterology and Hepatology. Mysteries remain. Now the question remains, what caused the cancer? Despite Connolly's suggestion of genetic predisposition to the ailment, study author Genta says the jury is out on what exactly killed Napoleon's father and sister. Based on autopsy reports, Genta said, it is impossible to determine conclusively that the tumor that reportedly killed Napoleon's father was cancerous. And none of Napoleon's siblings were subject to autopsy, making his sister's stomach cancer diagnosis dubious. Instead, Genta said, Napoleon's lesion points to chronic infection by Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria that can cause stomach inflammation and increase the likelihood of gastric cancer. An 18th century soldier's diet short on fresh meats, fruits, or vegetables may have boosted that risk even further, Genta added. Napoleon historian Connolly agreed that food might have played some role. Diet was not all that good in those days. They pretty much ate whatever tasted good. Still, he said, Napoleon's diet was better than the average. On military campaigns, Connolly said, I think he had more fresh food than ordinary soldiers. His flunkies would go out and get fresh chickens, and what have you for him. And the emperor was not known for gluttony, Connolly added. Napoleon was very abstemious. He even watered down his wine, he said. And he was famous for eating a meal in 15 minutes, standing up. He was the original multitasker. Whatever the cause of the emperor's alleged cancer, his enemies need not have worried about a possible return to power. Study author Genta said, this analysis suggests that, even if the emperor had been released or escaped from the island, his terminal condition would have prevented him from playing a further major role in the theater of European history. When Napoleon lived, he left many historical victories that mankind will never forget. When he died, it still left many mysteries that science and the world still had to explore. His immortal words still remain with the world. The only way to lead people is to show them a future. A leader is a dealer in hope. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. Envy is a declaration of inferiority. The reason most people fail instead of succeed is they trade what they want most for what they want at the moment. If you wish to be a success in the world, promise everything, deliver nothing.